Professor Ellenico, so I want to thank you very much for the very generous presentation. I hope to live up to a bit of it. So, I'd also like to thank Professor Koukousas and Professor Arabatsis for inviting me to speak today on a fascinating topic. They had originally asked me to speak about something post-Byzantine, but that was way beyond my capacities. So the talk today will seem very Byzantine and linked to the 11th century, but in fact is covering themes that are Byzantine and post-Byzantine, as you will see. And specifically the question not of foreign relations, but the question of Muslims living within the Byzantine Empire. That is actually the key of this topic. The Byzantine Empire saw the rise of Islam as an invasion and then as a neighboring power. It lost the Middle East and North Africa to opponents who carried the banner of a new religion. The process is defined by the reconquest of Syria, by the conquest of Syria in 638 and the fall of Gibraltar in 711, which in some Arabic sources is referred to as a Byzantine stronghold, the last Byzantine outpost in Spain. The language of administration in Syria and Egypt continued to be Greek until the capital of the Caliphate was moved to Baghdad in 750. From this date on, the Islamic world and the Byzantine Empire shared a border. Foreign relations are different from the question of Byzantine Islam, that is, the presence of Muslims within the Byzantine Empire. The first ambiguity to dispel is that Islam is a religion while Byzantium is a state. The religious opposition somehow was between the Orthodox Church and the Muslim community, since they differed on the nature and object of their beliefs. There are many polemical treatises written on both sides. Muslim treatises against Christians and Orthodox treatises against Muslims, but that's a different topic. However, the Byzantine state had no specific problem with religion. Indeed, the East Roman Empire employed a legal and government structure which derived from society which had a different religion. Roman law was written by and for pagans in Rome and was codified by Christian emperors in Constantinople. I think that's the main change, the codification. The laws were the same, but selected according to the new needs by the Emperor Theodosius and Justinian. Let's see if I can get to the next slide. Yeah. The laws applied to all citizens regardless of religion. This is in the Codex Theodosianus 2.110, the Codex Justinianus 198, and then the Basilica, which publishes the same law in 1136 for the year 398. For example, the Codex Justinianus 1914 of the year 412 says that whoever damages a building owned by a Jew will be subject to the same punishment as if he had destroyed the property of a Christian. This is also repeated in the Basilica, which was published in the 9th century. The reason is that what defined citizenship were the borders, not the religion, nor the ethnic group. Indeed, the Constitutio Antoniana, or the Edict of Caracalla, issued in 212, defined all those living within the Roman borders as Roman citizens. The law survives only in Justinian's Codex and is translated in the Basilica in the 9th century, reflecting a Byzantine attitude. Borders define the country. This edict made borders an essential part of Roman and Byzantine identity. It had not been the case before 212. Borders were also important to the Byzantines. The borders were so important to the Byzantines that when the Turks encountered them, they adopted the Greek word for border. The Turkish synode derives from synoron and is used to this day. The imperial bureaucracy dealt with persons living within these borders. It was therefore used to dealing with people who were not Orthodox Christians and whose first language was not necessarily Greek, depending on the area, obviously. The most interesting example is that of the bureaucrat Kikavmenos, who wrote a book of advice for his son in the 11th century. And this is actually his seal, that we actually have the seal of Kikavmenos himself. And I quote the passage, since I think it's very important. And do not say, quote, such and such does not follow the religious rules and is happy, unquote. For you do not know what such a person is going through in secret. For in secret, some do good things, escaping the notice not only of men, but also of the devil. For in secret, some do good, If some are happy and continue to be evil, no wonder. For Jews, heretics, Saracens, and simply many others who do not have the experience of our beliefs, nor do they live in the expectation of our Lord Jesus Christ, the true God, some of them are happy and rule nations and enjoy the goodness of God, and we do not envy their happiness. For his goodness knows by which judgments he administers all. Kikavmenos was not a zealot. He was a bureaucrat. One should remember that when Constantine I allowed Christians not to be persecuted and to set up the rules for their church, these were not the same as laws. That is why they're called canons, canons rather than normi. They are internal regulations and identify the internal functioning of a community. Later emperors, such as Justinian, decided that secular decisions could be based on the canons of the first 4 ecumenical councils. This is the novel 131 of Justinian, but it's very interesting. He'd already published his codex of laws. The various laws were published. The novels are additions afterwards, probably for practical reasons. In the Basilica law code, the canons of the 7 ecumenical councils had the value of law. This is Basilica 532-3. But no other canons could be used in secular courts. Having canons within a secular law code means that a secular judge could condemn someone based on those rules. That's why it's important. This was the environment in which Byzantine Muslims found themselves. They had some sort of privileges. For example, they had places to worship in the empire, as the Emperor Constantine VII in the 10th century informed us. And here I read, Masalamas was offspring of Muawiyah. He had led an expedition against Constantinople, for whom, by his request, the Mosque of the Saracens was built in the imperial praetorium. He was not leader of the Arabs, since Suleiman was leader of the Saracens, while Musalamas served in the rank of general. So here we see a praetorium, a very important government building in Constantinople with a mosque inside. This mosque is referred to in Arab sources. The Arabic sources are aware of this, and they talk about different phases. Visitors to Constantinople who saw this building. So this is not just a specific Greek attitude, it's a real building. It was restored by Constantine IX Monomachos in the 1040s, the same emperor, as we're informed by the Arabic sources, the same emperor who at the same time, circa 1046-1048, restored the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem after the destruction by the Caliph al-Hakim. When the Turks conquered Constantinople in 1453, they sought to pray in the old mosque of Masalamas. Apparently they entered the gates and were looking for this old mosque. It was therefore still standing and possibly functioning between the 11th and the 15th century. Patriarch Nicholas I Mystikos in the 10th century, in his letter to the Caliph, describes this mosque as a place of prayer and the way in which Muslims were looked after in Constantinople. And here I quote, "So listen, great and superior man of the Saracen nation. Those who ruled the Romans from the beginning established the matters concerning prisoners thus. Since they knew that until there is a status of war, one should fight for the defeat of one's enemies. But once one has captured the fighters, to look after them like the poor and to show care for their unfortunate life, so that nothing else painful occur other than the distance alone from home and their family and friends and relatives. Therefore, they have large lodgings and the enjoyment of clean air and those other things which contribute to human life, such as a place of worship reserved for those of the same nation, same belief, and your religion. This is an extraordinary text, actually. It's a sort of Geneva Convention before it was written. But it also indicates that the air in Constantinople was not very good, because that seems to be a permanent problem. They're always looking for good air in the city. The letter of Nicholas Mystikos, the text of Constantine Porphyrogenitus, and the passage of Kikaphmenos tell us that there were Muslims in Constantinople and the wider empire. They were not necessarily converted. However, one should be careful. Nicholas and Constantine refer to the location of the mosque within imperial property, the Domus Divina, the Theos Ikos. So one can imagine the mosque was some sort of Evais Ikos, something like that. Anyway, legally that was the status. In other words, an area which was not subject to Roman law, to citizen law. It had a sort of, but it was subject to jus gentium. So in our terms, it's a sort of extraterritoriality, directly dependent on the emperor. This is a complicated question, but interesting for this mosque in particular. Indeed, that fits with what Kikaphmenos has claimed in the passage when he says that people who don't know about Christianity are capable of doing good things, since it depends on God, not on the religion in that passage. He says that each people can worship their God since they live in different areas which may have not known Christianity, a typical view of the law of nations. Thus, Muslims could worship freely when subject to jus gentium. As prisoners were subject to it. As guests, temporary residents, that's the xenodochia famous in Constantinople, and as foreign dignitaries on embassies, and the ambassadors had a special status as well. Among the prisoners who may have prayed here was the famed Arabic poet Abu Firas, who wrote a famous collection of poems while imprisoned in Constantinople, known as the Rumiyat. The Roman collection, Rome obviously is Roman, the Rumiyat is the Roman collection, which is actually, later on, the title was copied by Omar Khayyam as the Rubiyat, but it's actually referring to Abu Firas's collection, which is earlier, 10th century. Conversion does not really concern those people subject to jus gentium. Cohabitation, in this case, is the key. However, the Jewish community seems to represent regular Roman citizens who happen to have another religion, as mentioned in the legal code before. This example allows one to seek the case of citizens who were Muslims. Before exploring such an option, one should look at Muslims living within the empire who do not have an official connection with other country. There are two important cases one may describe. It is a difficult question, but one may address it in terms of communities. In other words, one should look at the case of the Abu Taghli tribe, which entered Byzantine territory and became subject to Byzantine laws in approximately 935. This is the question of what in Roman law would have been the federati, populations who move in and are federated. It's not clear what their status, how they're subject to Roman law, but they seem generally to be treated like citizens. The lack of evidence is very important. Indeed, for once, an argumentum e silentio might have something positive and indicate that we're not object of official persecution. They settled within Byzantine borders, and their cohabitation, whether as Christians or Muslims, became worthy of neglect. And neglect for minorities is very important. Even more important is the case of the Alawite community, considered by some an offshoot of Shia Islam. Some say it's acceptable, some people say it's heretical. It doesn't concern us here today. Today, one generally associates the Alawite community in the Arab world with Syria, and they're mainly on the coastal area around the city of Latakia, Laodikia in Greek. The city was reconquered by Ioannis Thimiskis in 975. He probably built the fortress of Saon, which is now known as Saladin, which you see on the left, which has remarkable and striking similarities to the fortress in Veliko Turnovo, and also has the same square towers. So I would argue it's a Byzantine fortress. Also on the towers, the letters, there are Greek letters to indicate the levels at which to put the stones. I think that's conclusive. One of the Alawite traditions is that the Caliphate persecuted them in Aleppo, and their chief theologian and scholar, one of the last ones for this time, Al-Tabarani, moved to Latakia in 1032. He is considered the last main theologian who codified many Alawite beliefs still followed today, apparently. What is not said is that he moved from Caliphate territory and settled into Byzantine territory. Apparently, there were no Alawites in the area before he arrived. In other words, the current Alawite presence dates to Byzantine reconquest of coastal Syria. The fact the Greek sources do not talk about this and generally are not very good about informing us about this area is important. The historian one relies on until 1033 is Yahya al-Antaki, an Arabic-speaking Christian from Antioch, but in some ways that's a different world. Antioch is a big city. We're talking about a community, minority of Muslims within a foreign territory. So it's two different planets. However, the point remains, the Greek sources do not speak about citizens who are minorities. The Romani population, for example, whose language retains some Byzantine words, for example, the word drom, from dromos, for a road. Even though there are almost no Greek sources referring to their long residence in Byzantine Anatolia, they have many crystallized Greek words in their language. There are many reasons for this, but neglect may be one of them. In other words, citizens were a minimal concern. It may be due to taxation method, known from the Martian treaties here in Venice, for example, the village communities, which from the emperor's point of view, or more precisely from the bureaucrats, required to gather collective taxes from villages and communities without asking details on their internal administration. This is very practical. The bureaucrat goes to the village and says, give me the one payment for the entire village and I won't ask questions. Fantastic. It also means that when Byzantine administration disappeared in Anatolia and small feudal states replaced local administration, these minorities suddenly emerged on the map. Because instead of being lost in a very wide area, they suddenly found themselves minorities in much smaller states. So much more complicated situation. Indeed, Parebreus in Syriac says many Alawites were killed when the Latin Crusaders took Latakia from the Byzantines in the late 11th century or early 12th century. This needs to be related to the Byzantine persecutions of Syrian Christians in southeastern Anatolia in the reigns of Constantine VIII and Romanos III, in all fairness. This was initiated by a local Orthodox metropolitan of Meritene, Malatia, and someone admired by Psellos. Psellos wrote a whole encomium for this man. The local governor and army did not really listen to him, and he appealed to Constantinople. Very briefly, the metropolitan of Malatia says, there's all these heretics living all around me. I'm very upset. It doesn't work with orthodoxy. And the local army and police basically said, well, so what? They didn't do anything. So he had to go to the Patriarchal Tribunal in Constantinople. The Patriarchal Tribunal convinced the emperor to do something about it, Constantine VIII, who was rather interested in religion, and Romanos III as well. And so something happened, but from Constantinople, locally, no one wanted to touch these Syrians. Apparently they were very rich as well. So this confirms that secular authorities were not interested specifically in theological discussions. Their aim was not to rock the boat and simply to collect taxes. Cohabitation seems to be the rule among the bureaucracy, while conversion was the concern for religious figures, which makes sense. Cohabitation simply required payment of taxes. Indeed, in order not to pay taxes, one should live outside the governor's jurisdiction. In a remarkable passage associated to the first siege of Theodosiopolis, in the middle of the 10th century, of the 11th century, today known as Erzurum, one sees how the Byzantine administration tried to rein in people. Indeed, the Syrians, Armenians, and others, very probably Muslims as well, had created a settlement, Artse, that's what it's called in Greek, Artse. After the Byzantine era, the city of Theodosiopolis changed its name to Artse of the Romans, which is now Erzurum. Erzurum. Revealing the different jurisdiction had remained in people's memories. And here I quote the passage. So I think I put that. Yes, I did. The settlement of Artse is populous and has great wealth, for in it lived real merchants and not a small number of Syrians, Armenians, and other nations. They were confident in their own number and did not accept to be inside the walls, and this though Theodosiopolis was nearby, a very large city which had a strong and unbreached fortification. That fortification you see there. And you can see the reason why the governor would say come in is because it was on top of the hill, fortified, makes sense. And even though Kikafmenos had often threatened and called them, so he's writing letters, apparently Las Diversi refers to the letters of Kikafmenos as well. So religion favored conversion, while administration preferred cohabitation. One may conclude by indicating that the emir of Aleppo, Mansur ibn Lulu, who was emir in 1007 to 1016, fled the city in 1016, settled in Byzantine territory, where he was given lands by Basil II, in the same way that Sennacherib Barsuni received lands in Cappadocia. It's the same idea. So he was given lands by Basil II, and in 1030 tried to conquer Aleppo beside the Emperor Romanos III in the Battle of Azazion in Greek. And there you see Romanos III in his imperial tent with imperial red, of course, porphyry. This anecdote reveals the effect, by the way, the color of the tent is referred to in Livy as well. We know that Augustus had a red tent, just to point the continuity. This anecdote reveals the effective reality of Byzantine Islam. There were prisoners who were allowed to worship in a mosque built for them. There were emirs who were allies to the Byzantine emperor and helped to persuade the local population to become Roman. And there were the neglected citizens, which carried on with their lives, like Alawites or the inhabitants of Theodosiopolis, or better, of Artse. While it may appear that one is focused entirely on the 11th century, the existence of the Alawites, or the multi-ethnic history of Erzurum, or the presence of the Mosque of Maslamas in Constantinople after the 15th century indicates that the Byzantine model survived long after the Byzantine administration had effectively lost control of those areas. It's a system that worked, so it just went on. In this manner, one may easily compare and contrast the rather similar notion of millet in the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantines had very strict notions about orthodoxy, but those applied mainly to Christians of other denominations, but a rather flexible view of about day-to-day living beside different religions and peoples. Strict in words and tolerant in deeds. Thank you very much.
Για την εμπεριστατωμένη εισήγηση που μας παρουσίασε. Θα περάσουμε στον